Welcome everyone. We're going to get started, and this is a good time for the Lakefield Historical Society because every year we talk about this time prior to November the 11th about our veterans. And it's something that the Lakefield Historical Society has done a lot over the years. You may have seen our Lakefield War Vet site. We have the history of almost all of the First World War veterans that served in Lakefield, and about a third of World War II veterans. And so we'd like to continue that work this year. But with the World War II veterans, we can't get the information because it's still private. And so if you are related to somebody who is a World War II veteran from Lakefield, you can request this. And it's a fairly simple process online. You pay $10. Eventually they send you the information. And if we have that information, we can ensure that your loved one is up there and recognized with everyone else. So keep that in mind. Michael will be talking tonight, but first of all, I'm going to acknowledge the First Nations land acknowledgement, which we always do. We respectfully acknowledge that the former village of Lakefield is located on the Treaty 20 Michisaegig territory and in the traditional territory of the Michisaegig and Chippewa nations, collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations, which include Curve Lake, Hiawatha, Alderville, Scugog Island, Rama, Boseal and Georgina Island First Nations. Lakefield Historical Society respectfully acknowledges that the Williams Treaties First Nations are the stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity, and that they will continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure their health and integrity for generations to come. So that's something to think about when we talk about truth and reconciliation. We're only now, as European descendants, actually starting to come to terms with what happened with our ancestors when they first settled this area. And we're making some positive steps, and the Lakefield Historical Society certainly supports those positive steps. Tonight, Michael Barrett will be talking. And Michael is also Vice President of Lakefield Historical Society. He's an excellent speaker. In fact, he's the only speaker I know that got a standing ovation before he started talking. It's a true story. He's done a lot of research about the Italian campaigns and the Sicily campaigns. It's close to his heart. He's actually visited some of the sites. And so I'm sure that he knows a lot more than I do about it. My only connection is I'm also an ex-Hasty P, when Hasty P were most of the people who went over that section. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Michael, and we're glad to have you talk for us.
Okay, thank you. And it is interesting. Michael says expert. Is that okay? Still can you hear me fine?
Yep.
I wouldn't necessarily consider myself an expert. I'm probably more of an expert on raising daughters because I have 5 of them, and so I can tell you, how many showers a daughter takes and how many rolls of toilet paper they use, and how to be able to get rid of really horrible boyfriends and things like that. So I'm probably more of an expert on that, but I do love history. History has always been a part of my being, whether it's old cars or whether it's, and now it's certainly history. I started life as a history teacher, could not get a full-time job, so I moved on to a different career, but it's always been part of my, this is my happy place when we start talking about history. And what's great is that the older I get, the closer I get to being history. And it's really great when you meet some of these people like Maureen, for example, that can give me all the history pieces and stuff of everything that's going on. So, but even like if you think about it, like on our honeymoon, I've been married 41 years. Where did I take my wife on our honeymoon? I took her to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. I was quite a romantic, for sure. But what I want to be able to talk about tonight is certainly what I entitle the Forgotten Sacrifice. Because if you look at the Battle of Sicily, it's something that is typically forgotten. If you listen to American podcasts or read American history books, Canadians never even landed on the island. If you listen to the British, while they will give some tacit recognition to the Canadian contribution as part of the 8th Army, it is more of a footnote than it is the reality. The reality is, and I'm biased, as I said to a few people here tonight in the preamble conversation, I'm absolutely biased with regards to the Canadian contribution, not only in Sicily, but into the Battle of Italy. They called the Battle of Italy the Champagne Tour, or the Draft Day Dodgers, because they did not go into France. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, how the Battle of Sicily impacted the Canadian effort, not only on June the 6th, but also through France and then into Holland as well, because they divided the army at that point. But certainly the Champagne Tour, or the Draft Day Dodgers, was the furthest from the truth. The Italian campaign was one of the most deadly, casualty-driven battles, and I'm going to explain why. As Michael had mentioned, I did travel to Sicily. I went over the summer before last, went and visited a friend in Calabria, spent 3 weeks in Calabria, and when I said to my friend who has a vacation home there, I said, I want to go to Sicily to be able to see the battle sites, and I want to be able to go to the Agira grave site. I also wanted to go to the Catania Commonwealth War site. The response I got from my friends was, why? We don't go to those things. We don't celebrate those things. And besides, he said, it's so far away. It was an hour-and-a-half drive to the ferry, and then it was a 2-hour drive once I took the ferry to Agira, and then come back to Catania. And I will share some of my experiences on driving through that. It was not that far. I said to them, I commute that far, typically. We're talking a small island, but we're talking about major consequences in the battle. Oops, if I actually put the right button. So, the Battle of the Husky operation started on July the 9th. So it is, like I said, there's a lot of myths about this battle. It's 1 month, 1 week, 1 day. If you want to remember how long it took, it's the Battle of the Ones. But there are a lot of myths about what happened when you look at going. They say it was easy. It's only 38 days. It was not easy when you look at some of the terrain and some of the consequences of the battle. It was not necessarily a battle that was necessarily going to be won, and I'll talk about that as well. The myth is that the Italian army fled and ran. On the coast, that was true, and I'll talk about that when we look at some of the maps of the battle. But you also have to remember at this point that the Italian army had finished up in Tunisia. And you know the old joke? Anybody here Italian descent? You know, where do Italians keep their armies? In their sleeveys. Get it? So, yes. So if you're going to practice for the Italian army, when I was listening to as a kid, what did they do in basic training? They went like this, just to sort of. And for some of the battles in North Africa, that was certainly true. When you got into Sicily, the Sicilian troops along the coast, which I'll show, certainly did not fight hard. They were conscripts. The Germans treated them horrendously. The Germans also massacred many Sicilian villagers. They had no heart. The armies that had come from Tunisia were battle hardened. The ones that wanted to be captured in North Africa were captured. The best Italian troops were stationed in Sicily. And they weren't stationed on the coast. They were stationed in the mountains. And they fought hard with skill until the Battle of Asoro. And then they gave up after that. So, Also, if you listen to American podcasts, Americans won the day. I have listened to many podcasts just in anticipation of being able to do this and to tighten my knowledge and to get some stories, etc., and to refresh myself. The American, of course, history is always the Americans won the day. You know, after December the 7th, they won the European War, they won the Pacific War, you know. And again, I am not knocking the American contribution in the war. Please, I'm not doing that. But in the Battle of Sicily, the Canadians were the scroungers in order to be able to get things done. When the battle got tough, the Canadians were part of that toughness. And also, the belief that the Axis really didn't want to defend Sicily. The Axis knew that the invasion of Sicily was going to come. You know, this was not a surprise. What the German strategy was to be able to defend Sicily for a long time as they defended Italy. Italy was a very protracted war up the boot. Took a long time, a lot of casualties, a lot of death in order to be able to conquer the most of the boot of Italy by the end of the Second World War. They anticipated doing that in Italy as well. They intended to be able to hold the Allies for a long time in Sicily. But a couple of battles determined that was not going to be the case. And I'll talk about the Catania Plains on where it almost came true. But for the bravery of the Canadians, the Hasty Ps, which changed the tide of the war and literally stuck it to the Germans in the rear. And I'll talk about that. There was no rivalry between the Allies. I would say, if I was going to write a book, which I'm not going to, that my title for the Battle of Sicily would be The Battle of Egos. Because when I go through who fought and who led in Sicily during that campaign, it is the who's who of the Second World War. And you don't make it to be a generalship or a field marshal without having an ego. And it was the Battle of Egos. There was an extreme rivalry going on in the Battle of Sicily on who would be the army that captured Messina, because that was the goal. And the Allies erred in letting the Germans escape. 2 divisions of Germans were able to get off the island. The Germans were smart because they figured out what the Allies were doing. The Allies are by the clock. And in reading some of the German manuscripts, the Allies had some very bad habits. Number one is they never flew their fighters at lunchtime. As one of the individuals said, German Air Luftwaffe said, it was great to see that the Americans and the British were the same, because that sacredness and the holiness of lunchtime allowed us to be able to get our soldiers across the Strait of Messina, which is only 1.5 miles. Also, the Allies did not fly sorties at night. So literally in the darkened hours, now it was July and August, I was there in August, it is 41 degrees. It's 1.5 miles though. They stopped flying sorties after it got dark. So they had 4 or 5 hours to load the ferries and get the Germans and Italians across. 2 divisions escaped that way. Now I'm going to tell you, from a historical perspective, this is Mike Barrett's historical perspective, so it's worth nothing. The 2 divisions did not make a difference. Did those 2 divisions fight all the way back up through Italy? They did. But the reality is 24 German divisions fought in Italy. And that 24 divisions were tied up in the Battle of Italy. That was 24 divisions that did not go into France. It was 24 divisions that were not on the Russian front. So 2 divisions, yes, it's very unfortunate, but it did not change the outcome of the war. And the reality is, and history would tell us, retreats are typically successful. If you think of Dunkirk in 1940, 342,000 British and French were exited from the beach. They all exited, left their equipment behind, but they exited. Even Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in the war, in 1812, was successful. You say, wait a minute, it was not successful. The armies didn't get Napoleon, it was the weather that got Napoleon. Retreats in history are typically successful, and so was this one. If they're done right, and Germans were good, it was not did not change the outcome of the war. And the belief this was tank country. The British and the Americans, they'd come out of North Africa, where tanks were very, very critical to the Battle of Africa. They looked at some of the plains on their demographic maps, I'll show them to you, and they thought, we can take tanks. It is not tank country. The hills, the valleys, the vineyards, the streams, the fjords, it was just horrendous. It was not tank country. And unfortunately, a Canadian disaster caused them to have difficulties, and I'll mention that in a minute. And the belief is that battle has little consequences. If you look at the Canadian Encyclopedia of the Second World War, there's a paragraph on the Battle of Sicily. The Battle of Sicily, again, I'm biased because I've studied it. The Battle of Sicily is really the turning point in the battle against Fortress Europe, because the lessons learned in Sicily were incredibly important for the success on June 6, 1944. So, as a good historian, I'm going to take you one step forward and 2 steps back, because I'm the person who believes that you should understand the context of what you're looking at when you're talking about Sicily. So we can't start, say, okay, July the 9th, this happened. No, we have to talk about what happened before, because you've got to know everything. And in the next 3 hours or so, I'll make sure that you get the information that you need. Nancy, just 3 hours for you. So I know where you eat, Nancy. Okay, so I met Nancy at the Chinese food restaurant the other night. So, and I got a hug, which was terrific. So, because I want to take you back, because there was a lot of change that took place between Canada when they entered the First World War in 1914, because they were automatically at war in as part of the British Empire. There was no declaration of war from Canada. There was a declaration of war on Britain on August the 4th, and Canada, as part of the empire, just was part of it, and they were automatically at war. Not so in 1939. There was a lot of change that took place between 1914 and 1939. I could give you another whole history lesson on the changes that took place. Statute of Westminster, 1931, the opening of Canada's first overseas consulate. I can talk about all that stuff between 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, to 1939, when they declared war. But by 1939, Canada had to declare war on their own. And so that occurred on September the 10th, 1939, where the Canadian Parliament voted to declare war. They did not have to, likely would have, in the context of what the nation was, the tide of Britain at that point. But between 14 and 39, Canada had to declare war on their own, and did so on September the 10th. And if you remember, in history in 1939, there was the tour of King George and Queen Elizabeth that came. And there was only really one reason why they came. They came here and into Washington in order to firm up support for an inevitable conflict that was going to take place. And they dined with the Roosevelts at Hyde Park, with the Queen Mother with her parasol and looking like the regal queen, and her clothes were chosen with making sure that she looked like a queen. And then the cross-Canada tour that King George and Queen Elizabeth took in order to firm up support. Because as they knew the battle was coming, they wanted to ensure that Canada was going to be aligned. They knew they were going to depend upon the Dominions, and there was like 5 of them at that point, for their support. Only the Republic of Ireland did not declare war. Ireland remained neutral during the war. But South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, they all made sure they declared war. Now, prior to Husky, Canada had made some significant contributions to the war effort. First was literally within 48 hours, the Canadian Navy, and I'm going to put quotes around the Canadian Navy because there wasn't much of the Canadian Navy in 1939. It probably consisted of 3 or 4 ships. There was not much in 39. But literally within 48 hours, what frigates we did have were on convoy duty across the Atlantic because the U-boats created absolute havoc. Britain could have lost the war not being able to control the Battle of the Atlantic. Canada was part of that. And to put it in perspective, in 1945, Canada had the 3rd largest navy in the world. Now, by 1950, not so much. But the Commonwealth Training Program literally was approved in 1939. Started in Western Canada, where Commonwealth pilots were trained. 127,000 personnel were trained, 50,000 pilots, which ultimately flew for the Royal Air Force, or the Royal Canadian Air Force, or the Polish wing, or the Norwegian wing. They were trained in Canada. Little Norway, as you may know of, were trained in Canada. My Uncle Bob, who flew for the RCF on 2 completed missions, trained out in Saskatchewan, and then went to England to fly the bombers. And of course, the Hasty Ps, for a very brief moment in 1940, went with the British into France in May of 1940. Went into France, got to the position where they were supposed to fight, and hastily, if you excuse the pun, turned around and exited France. Because by that point, by June, France was being overrun. The Hasty Ps are known, though, to be able to actually to be the Canadians that downed the first American fighter jet, a Stuka. So apparently with a handgun. Whether it's true or not, I'm not sure. So then, of course, Canadians went to Hong Kong. They landed in Hong Kong just before the Japanese invaded. And if you weren't killed in Hong Kong, you unfortunately were taken a prisoner in Hong Kong, and you spent the next 4 years in a prisoner of war camp. In fact, 1/3 of the prisoners of war, Canadian prisoners of war, perished in those prisoner of war camps. And then lastly, as we know, Dieppe in 1942, the raid that was supposed to teach us lessons. My Uncle Harold was captured at Dieppe and spent 3 years in a prisoner of war camp in Prussia, and was evacuated in 1945 and suffered from frozen feet for the rest of his life. Could always shuffle. So, but that was our contribution. Now, this is important to recognize because that's how we get into Sicily, and I'll explain that. So we look at 1942. So this is where it's 1942. Now, 1942 is the lowest point in the Second World War. It was, certainly Americans were now in the war after Pearl Harbor, but the reality is when you're starting looking at 1942, there was not a guarantee that the war was going to be successful. American military might had not really exercised itself. In 1942, there's a Battle of Midway. There's a couple of important victories, but 1942 is still very ugly. The Germans do their second offensive around the Volga River, in trying to capture the oil supplies in Russia. It is not pretty in 1942. So, but daringly, on August the 9th, 1942, General Alexander, who was head of the 8th Army, said on August the 9th, which is the deepest, darkest day for the British in Africa. The Germans were into Egypt, almost at going to break through to capture the Nile, which would have been an absolute disaster. Very bold for General Alexander on August the 9th to say, "We shall not retreat." And for the better or worse, for the most part, the war from that point, I'm not saying it was prophetic, it's more of just very, very brave to say on August 9th, 1942, we will not retreat. And that was made, and from that point, the war started to shift. But it wasn't until really August 1942. There was a lot of dark days. So, Sicily, or Sicilia. So, why Sicily? Like, why is that important in 1943? Well, I'm going to take you back even further to 117 AD. So, I've got to show you my 4 years of history at University of Toronto and the tens of thousands of dollars that I spent. But, very quickly, it's hard to believe, but Sicily was always the center of the Roman Empire. Sicily always controlled the avenue into the Mediterranean. In the Roman Empire, Sicily was Fortress Europe. It was also known as the breadbasket. Hard to believe today, because I've been there. This was where most of the grain, most of the foodstuffs, the best wine was all made in Sicily. It was the first province that the Romans actually captured when they were beginning to build their empire. Sicily has always been at the crossroads, and even more so when we get into World War II, because this is 1942. So this is the darkest day. So you see this, oops. This is the darkest day. This is the furthest that the Germans penetrated into Egypt. That's August 9th, 1942. They literally, if they had broken through and captured the Nile, it would have been very, very difficult for the British to recover. But in the middle, what is occurring? So what we have here is Turkey, neutral. Spain and Portugal, neutral. France, Vichy France, emasculated. At this point, Free French, the Italians occupy Libya, the Germans are in with their Africa Corps and trying to be able to take here. Sicily sits in the middle. It is the source of their U-boat stations. It is where their their Air Force refuels. It's where it's repaired. This is the center. And the only piece that continues to be able to hold out is Malta. The British colony of Malta continues to be able to exist and survive, bombed mercilessly, so I can't even say that word, constantly through the Battle of the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, for all points in place, was an Italian-German lake with the hub on Sicily. And it was told the one story when they were trying to reinforce the British, they'd have to take a convoy from Britain, come all the way through the Strait of Gibraltar. Now the Spanish were neutral, but they sat there at the Strait of Gibraltar and told the Germans everything. But every time a convoy came through, so the Germans from Sicily could wait for them and bomb them. So while they were waiting, Bernard Montgomery was waiting to do an offensive. He required 6 tankers of oil, and it had to come up through here. All 6 tankers were bombed and destroyed, and the offensive was delayed. So that's how dangerous the Mediterranean was. It was an Italian-German lake with Sicily as the hub. And then we enter into 1943. So this is where we sit on January the 6th, 1943. This is what's happened. The British have pushed back from the Battle of Alamein, have pushed the Italians and Germans back in Tunisia and part of Libya. Malta continues to be able to exist, but as you can see, most of the Italian, this is where our air cover is from Sicily. You can still see it's a very dangerous place. So this is just prior, this is January the 6th. So it certainly looks like the end is near in the Battle of Africa. And so therefore, when they start to be able to look at what's next, and that's to free. Because let's take a look. So as I mentioned, oops, this is my fat thumbs. So what we have here is, we've got Malta continues to hold out. This is why Sicily is important. to relieve Malta. Malta's been bombed every single day since the start of the war at the invasion of France on May the 10th, 1940. We have Turkey that continues to remain neutral, but Britain continuously hopes that if they can shift the balance of power, Turkey may join the Allies. Didn't happen until 1945, once they saw the writing on the wall. Russia continues to be able to be obliterated, although the the invasion, the second invasion of Russia in 1942, Stalingrad is not quite over at this point, but Russia is screaming for help, and we got to put it into perspective. You know, we're not talking hundreds of thousands of Russians. We're talking about millions of Russians that are being killed on the Eastern Front. Now, we may see Russians in a different light today, you know, in the sense with the invasion of Ukraine. I have a whole different viewpoint here. But in 1943, as allies, they were literally holding the fort and massacring and sacrificing their own citizens in order to be able to push the Germans back on the Eastern Front. They are screaming for a second front. And then we have here Romania. And what's Romania? Romania is the only source of oil that is German controlled for the German war effort. Hard to believe today when you think about it. Romania, named Romania because it was a province of the Roman Empire. See, I've linked those back to the Roman Empire. But in the oil fields, in order to be able to bomb the oil fields, and there have been a couple of raids, they literally flew all the way from Britain, all the way across Europe to bomb these oil fields. The effectiveness was not very good. Besides losing most of your planes flying across Germany in order to get there, they didn't really destroy too much. But they believed if they could somehow bomb, and they could do it better from here, they could technically take Romania out and take those oil fields out. Germany depended upon those oil fields right throughout the war. Of course, do we know if Romania today is an oil-producing country? They still produce oil, but the reality was most of it was used in World War II. So what did the world look like just prior to the invasion of Sicily in 1943? So these are the hot spots. Well, we've got Battle of Midway. The Americans are starting to fight back to island hop in the Pacific. There's a lot of war left to go. It is still not great. The island hopping battles are very, very costly for the Americans. You also have here the Battle of the Atlantic, starting to be won by June of 1943. Most of the U-boats are being destroyed. The convoy system is now being able to take better element. The air support is better, longer range aircraft. The Battle of the Atlantic is finally being won. It almost brought Britain to its knees in 1941 and 1942, but it's starting to be won. Britain is still being bombed, but the Battle of Britain is technically over by 1943. There's still air raids. The V1s and the V2s come later, but it's starting to change. Russia is starting to have success on the Eastern Front. The German army is being defeated, and the front is being pushed back. North Africa is now liberated by July the 8th. The Americans and the British have finally captured Tunisia and Libya. Africa is now free of German and Italian invaders. However, just to be able to put it in perspective, the Americans had their noses bloodied in North Africa. They came in 1942 at the Battle of Kassim, thought they were going to be able to do a great job, and they were horrible, sadly. They did not, they were not prepared, they were ill-trained, they were full of bravado, they didn't understand. The 8th Army, the 8th Army under Alexander Montgomery had been fighting there since 1940. They were battle-hardened. They knew what they were doing. They knew the terrain. The Americans would not listen, and they had their noses bloodied. So even though finally the war did end, the Americans, it was not their best showing. They were still very green. And it was the 8th Army that was going to be depended upon in the Battle of Sicily. So the world is changing on July the 8th, and that's why when they look, they say, okay, Sicily is next. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion. It was in January 14, 1943, when Roosevelt and Churchill and Charles de Gaulle got together at Casablanca in order to be able to talk about what's next. By January 14th, they were saying, okay, the Battle of Africa is almost over. What do we do next? It was not a foregone conclusion. It was going to be Sicily. There was a lot of conversation, discussion. Like, with all due respect, Churchill was a stubborn individual who believed that everything he said was right. And many times he was right. The development of the tank, those things, he saw. But he was a stubborn individual who believed in his philosophical approach. But he's only met by the ego of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who really believed that what we needed was a second front right away. His belief was that as soon as we finish the battle in Africa, get everybody together and send them into France, which would have been an unmitigated disaster without the lessons from Sicily. So there was a lot of fights. This was not exactly let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. There was a lot of fighting going on, Americans versus the British. And this was, if you put a line in the sand, this is the sand that Churchill realized that Britain was no longer the big three. It was the big two, plus the minor partner called Britain. Churchill was so frustrated, he only painted one picture. He was quite a painter. He only painted one picture in all of World War II. He was so frustrated with Roosevelt, he went in and painted one picture. And that was the only one he did between 1939 and the end of the war. Ultimately, he gave it to Roosevelt. Roosevelt never understood that it was really a slap in the face, because he was really saying to Roosevelt, I was not really part of the decision making, so I could take time off to paint a picture, and here you go. Roosevelt loved it, thought it was fantastic, a gift of friendship. It wasn't quite that way. But I've got the picture of Casablanca, because what's the first thing Roosevelt and Churchill did when they arrived in Casablanca? They literally got a private screening of the movie Casablanca. So that was the first order of business. So at January 14th, Churchill lobbied very hard for his philosophical approach called the soft underbelly of Europe. He believed that by attacking Sicily and then Italy, you would attack the alligator from the bottom, which is the soft underbelly. And it would hurt as much as if you attacked ferociously the mouth, which would be, as he's thought, the Battle of France. So they argued over this. And the only way that Churchill won that argument to invade Sicily was that he said that he agreed to the invasion of France in 1944. It was kind of the gentleman's deal. Okay, we'll go into Sicily. We're going into France in 1944. Because Churchill did not believe in attacking France head on. He believed you would go through Sicily, Italy, Greece, the Balkans, into Romania, the soft underbelly, not to be able to go directly into France. But that he agreed to it. And so that's how we ended up in Sicily. Okay, Winston, we'll go into Sicily, so shut up. We'll go into France in 1944. Yes, Franklin, that's what we'll do. So, and that's what occurred. So that decision was made on January the 14th. The next decision that was made that impacted us was on April the 27th, 1943. Because that's the day that this man gets involved. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, the Liberal Prime Minister of Canada, had been Prime Minister since 1935. If you remember that list of the Canadian involvement in World War II, he felt that it wasn't enough. And he lobbied very, very hard, directly to Winston Churchill, by telephone in order to demand that the Canadians play a significant role in the next invasion. He didn't know it was going to be Sicily, but he said, I don't care what happens, the next military operation has to involve Canadians. And I have accessed the 124-page document that was top secret in 1943 that laid out all the steps of that decision making. And there's quite an interesting few paragraphs where Winston Churchill almost says that Mackenzie King was almost crying on the phone in order to have Canadians involved. Canadians had not been involved since Dieppe in 1942. Canadians had been training in England, primarily in the Scotland Highlands, since their evacuation from France in 1940, with the exception of some of the individuals that went to Hong Kong, but they had been training since 1940. One Dieppe raid, but that wasn't enough. He was getting pressure at home, wanted to be able to show Canadians that they could also have a role to be able to play. Because he wanted this to happen, he wanted the publicity. Now this is from July the 28th, but this is what he wanted to see. These are two Canadians on their way to Sicily. This is well after the campaign started. But this is what he wanted. He wanted publicity. He wanted to be able to have Canadians involved. He wanted to be able to show that Canadians were an important element. Not that he's wrong, but the reality is he wanted them involved, and therefore when the decision was made to go into Sicily, Sicily was the next invasion. So the 8th Army had one brigade swapped out, and the Canadians were put in. Now, that didn't occur until May the 27th. That's when the Canadians became absolutely aware that they were going to Sicily. Didn't mean that the privates or the troops knew they were going, but that's when the decision was made, May the 27th. So if you think about it, they have May 27th, so let's say May's pretty well finished. You've got June, and you're into Sicily in July 9th. They have literally 6 weeks for preparation. Now someone will say, well, what did they have to prepare for? They've been preparing since 1940. But Sicily was going to be different. And we were having the conversation that Sicily was mountainous country. And in this 124-page document, it says one of the concerns we have is Canadians have not learned to fight in mountains. I mean, when we look at some of the regiments are from the prairies. I mean, their mountain is like a slough out in the middle of the prairie field. So, and one of the suggestions were they need to train to go up and down mountains. Perhaps they should be running up and down stairways in order to gain their thing. I mean, it was just because they weren't prepared for this. And again, the Canadians did not know they were going to Sicily until they got on the boats. They had no idea where they were going until they started to hand out the uniforms and they got shorts. And they knew, oh, I think we're going somewhere warm. So who is the cast in operations? As I said, this is the Battle of Egos. That's the title for the book. Because this Sicily is literally the who's who of the Second World War and who's involved in this little island. So we have General Andrew McNaughton, who's head of the Canadian Army. Later on gets kind of booted out because General Currar doesn't really like him too much. And they criticize him. And General Harry Currar was a miserable SOB. My interpretation. I see my friend at the back just kind of going, we'll talk. So I've done a lot of work on General Currar only because I went to General Currar Public School in Scarborough and I always wanted to know, who is this guy? So General Currar and General Andrew McNaughton did not get along. So by the end of the war, General McNaughton was kind of pushed off to the side. General Harry Currar, who became the lead of the Canadian Army, primarily in Holland, with General Montgomery. General Montgomery couldn't stand him either. So there was a lot of egos happening in the war. So whether you liked it and whether you succeeded or not was whether or not the person above you really liked you. Kind of happens in life. So then there was Major General Harry Sam, World War I veteran. He was automatically selected to be able to lead the Canadian forces onto Sicily. So he was told, literally, on April the 27th, he was going to be in charge. He was in England. and he was expected to be able to make his way to North Africa to begin the planning. And unfortunately, the flight that he was on was coming in for a landing, landed short of the runway, and he, along with his staff, were unfortunately killed, and obviously never did assume commanding the army. It was unfortunate. However, they had a second in command, Major General Guy Simmons, who was primarily trained after World War I. He attended the Royal Military College during the 1920s, 1930s. He's one of the few generals who really didn't have any experience in World War I. General Andrew McNaughton had lots of experience in World War I. So did Sam, and he had lots of experience fighting in World War I. Guy Simmons did not. He was primarily trained after the war, and he stepped in and became the lead, reporting to the 8th Army in order to be able to lead the Canadians into Sicily. And of course, we have Mussolini. Mussolini, not terribly involved in the Battle of Sicily, but he is one of the tragic figures, though I have no sympathy, in the Battle of Sicily, because it really determines his outcome. He's trying to guide what's happening, but is really lost at that point. He's really just a puppet at that point. Remember, Italy was still a kingdom, and therefore the king rebelled against him later on and kicked him out of office. Wouldn't have happened in 1939, but by 1943 it was able to happen. And then there's General Alfredo Guzzini, and he was in charge of the defense of Sicily. Technically, the Germans reported to him in 1943. He had fought in Albania, in Greece, in Ethiopia, had long been involved, a respected general in the Italian sphere of things, so much so that after the war he was not persecuted or prosecuted. He lived to 1960 and became a very respected figure in the Italian post-war development. Very rare for a World War II general to have that happen. And then we have General Kesselring, who started his career in the Luftwaffe. Fought in Poland, defended invasion of France, fought in Italy, and was put in charge of the German Army and Air Force in Sicily. Kesselring is a person that really retired in 1934 from the Army, but brought back in 1939, a wealth of experience, but also prosecuted after World War II because he ordered the massacre of 334 Italian soldiers, was ultimately acquitted because that was the way to do things after World War II when you're trying to make Germany an ally. So he was acquitted and was able to live out his natural life, but definitely ordered and signed to kill the 334 Italian soldiers. So Harold Alexander, who was also in World War II, was the head of the British 8th Army. A lot of experience, again, like in World War I, was really the mastermind behind the victory in Africa for the British. Worked with Bernard Montgomery. Alexander was the smarter of the two, but he was less daring than Montgomery. Alexander was a gentleman. Montgomery was horrible. He was not an easy guy to get along with. Was a very, very difficult general. And if he had been a little better temperament, he probably would have became the supreme commander in Europe, but he was very difficult to get along with. Churchill didn't like him. Nobody liked Bernard Montgomery, but he was daring, bold, and won a lot of victories. So, and General Montgomery. So, he's written many books, and the book should be entitled "I Love Myself," because most generals have different views. Anybody who writes an autobiography never writes about the bad stuff. So, but General Montgomery's just taken to the next level. But he was, the father of victory in Africa. Never gave up. Always fought. Looked for strategy. Had great ideas. But his ego, ultimately, as the war progressed, got the best of him. So, and then there's General Omar Bradley. I mean, this is just the who's who of World War II. General Omar Bradley, he's the field command. He reports directly to Patton. General Omar Bradley, again, he's an up-and-comer. He becomes even more important in World War II in Europe after Patton gets himself into trouble and Patton gets himself killed in a car accident. But it's actually during the Battle of Sicily that troops under Omar Bradley actually massacre 84 Italian and German soldiers. And the individual who's responsible was charged, was acquitted, but was later killed in September of 1944 after going to France. But there were some atrocities that took place. Not that Omar Bradley did it himself, but they happened under his command. And then we have Mr. Patton. I mean, General Patton has an ego bigger than my head. He is a very, very guy. Very successful general, don't get me wrong. But certainly ego is a very important thing to General Patton, rewriting history. Very successful. And it'll be very interesting when we talk just a little later on about the battle between the two as they drive to Messina. And then, of course, General Eisenhower is the overall commander for the Battle of Sicily. Okay. And certainly, as we have many divisions in here, but certainly close to our heart is the Hastings and Prince Edward, the Hasty P's, and of course Farley Mowat, as we know, is in the Hasty P's and has written 3 books on this. Some of the stories I take are from his books himself. Okay, so the Canadian 1st Division consisted of these regiments. They were all taken out of Scotland. They were taken away from the 1st Canadian Army. Has significant impact later on for the invasion of France. But they were hastily, if you excuse the pun, put together in order to form the Canadian 1st Division, and literally were told, to give you the date, when they were getting on the ship and where they were going. Hastily assembled, 6 weeks in order to be able to get prepared. On April 30th, 1943, they had something called Operation Mincemeat in preparation for the invasion of Sicily. And this was, if you've seen the movie, it's the Ruse, where they took a dead individual, invented a life for him, identity cards, and then dropped his body off the coast of France, froze him for months and months. In fact, I remember reading the one story where they took him out of the freezer, tried to put his boots on, the feet wouldn't unthaw, and they had to kind of put a blowtorch on them to get his feet into the boots to thaw him out. And this was the ruse in order to be able to convince the Germans that they were not going to attack Sicily, they were going to go to Sardinia or potentially even Greece. So apparently it did work. Whether or not it had significant impact on the preparation is another story. You can watch the movie on Netflix or wherever it is. At the end of the movie, they would say, "Oh, look, it worked, it worked." No, I'm not so sure. But certainly the Spanish took it for sure, believed it. Some Germans believed it, but Hitler always believed that the next battleground was going to be Sicily. I'm not saying he was brilliant. He just always said that was the place that they were going to go. That's where he would go. And so that's what he believed. But it does have consequences for June the 6th, 1944, and I'll talk about that later. So the battle. We're finally here. I've given you all the steps backwards. Now we're going to get into the battle. So the battle on June 28th. The battle for the Canadians started June the 28th because that's when the Canadians load the ships. Battle doesn't start till July the 10th. But Canadians are up in Scotland, so they have to load on June the 28th and come all the way down to the tip of Sicily. The Americans and British. Americans are in Tunisia, the British are in Egypt. So they have shorter distances to go. However, still not that short. It's still 900 miles from Egypt. It's not that short. But the Canadians, literally, it's June the 28th. So on June the 28th, they load the ships. They're on the ships until July the 10th. That's when they're handed their malaria pills, their shorts. I was going to say pith helmets, but there's discussion on whether they actually had pith helmets. But that's when they loaded the ship. That's when they knew where they were going. In some of the interviews that are online, people said, well, we had an idea where we're going to go, but weren't quite sure. Because they didn't know if they were going to go across, because they were training for the Battle of France. They didn't know. When they got the shorts, they knew they weren't going to France. So, Sicily has its own issues on geography. Lots of valleys. All the roads follow the rivers. They will often refer to as Highway 120 or Highway 91. I would call them highways in 1943. But the reality is, like any other country, all the roads follow the rivers. So that means they're always at the top, right? You're able to look down and bomb and have artillery. Dust. I have been there in August, September, and drove on some gravel roads, and really, the reality is there's no paved roads in 1943. They would see you coming for miles with plumes of dust. And August, like I was there August, first week of September, it was 41 and 42 degrees. Like you got out of the car to visit the sites, and it's just like instant sweat. So it's just, and I'm not marching. I'm riding around on air-conditioned rental cars. So this is a whole different perspective. And rock. This is volcanic rock. Mount Etna. So every time that there's an artillery shell, you get the shrapnel from the shell, then you get the shrapnel from the rock. And a rock will still hurt you as much as shrapnel. And many, many people, if it hit, it could be the rock shrapnel. It was as dangerous for you as the shrapnel from the shells. Water supply is very difficult. It's mountain. The Catania Plains have lots of water. Very limited water supply, and of course, millions and millions and millions of mosquitoes mean malaria. And so that's why they were given the malaria pills, but as many people were disabled because of malaria as well. So this is the topography, and you can see this is what they call the Catania Plain. Okay, so the whole island, this is the Catania Plain. It's not a plain. It is vineyards, gullies, small rivers, some marsh. That's where all the water drains the mountains into this area. So they believe that what they were going to do is once they got that to that plain, it's tank country, and away you go. It's not tank country. And there's the best, and the rest you can see is mountain. This is the mountains. You can see where the mountains exist. So where the British going? This is the plan. The British are going to land, well, no, I'll show you the next map. I won't talk about it because this is the next. So, what do we have on the island at the start? There's 200,000 Italian troops, 40,000 Germans that are ultimately reinforced. They get up to about 68 to 70,000 as reinforcements come from mainland Italy. There's 160,000 Allied troops that are landed by the afternoon of July the 10th. So I'm going to put that into perspective. More troops landed on Sicily in the first 24 hours than landed at D-Day. We often think of D-Day as the biggest invasion. It is and it isn't. They had more ships, they had more aircraft, but they didn't land more men. So everyone says, D-Day was the biggest land invasion. Nope. Michael Barrett says it's not so. So they had 3,000 Allied ships. Put into perspective, there's like 8,000 to 10,000 during D-Day, and 4,000 aircraft, and they probably had twice that many. But there were lessons learned from Sicily, and I'll explain those later. And there were 600 tanks that were landed on July the 10th. 600 tanks that became useless pretty fast. They were great on the roads if you didn't get them by the artillery. So July the 4th, tragedy happens as 3 Canadian frigates start to be able to move to Sicily. So the city of Venice, the Saint-Sete, I can't say it right, and the Davis were sunk by the U-409. And this was a tragedy for the Canadian. Now, 58 Canadians drowned, which in itself is a tragedy. 10% of the Canadians killed in the Battle of Sicily were killed by the U-409. But the biggest tragedy was on these 3 frigates, just by luck, there was over 500 motorized vehicles. The Brent carriers, the motorized trucks, some tanks, the ones that they needed the most to be able to move equipment. They lost 500. The Canadians fought on foot for the rest of the battle. When things were, they bought mules, they got board equipment from the 8th Army, and typical in the Army, the British gave them all the crap that they didn't really want and gave it to the Canadians. But this was a tragedy because it meant, and at the end of the war, the Canadians marched some 330 kilometers on foot, while the Americans and the British were technically more motorized than the Canadians, and it cost the Canadians dearly, like in the sense of the exertion, because you're talking about 41-degree heat. They marched further than any of the other 2 armies side by side. Oops. Okay, July the 9th. Now we're to the battle. They do a paratroop draw. Disaster. Half of the gliders don't even land. They end up in the ocean. Half of the military paratroopers were killed before they even landed on the ground. So then the other half missed their sights. So if you look at some of the American and the Commonwealth war cemetery in Catania, there's a lot of paratroopers there that never survived July the 10th. Lessons learned for July the 6th. It was not well orchestrated, although they had practiced for years. It just didn't work well. There was a lot of tragedy on June 6, 1944 as well, but they had learned a lot of lessons. Did they seize some of their objectives? Yes. But what was the biggest lesson that they learned? Because they ended up with very small paratroop drops, they found out that that was actually more effective than landing hundreds of people in one spot. Because of the tragedy, sometimes they only had 60 to 70 people. They were more effective at achieving their objectives than having a mass of a couple of hundred. But it was didn't go well. Now they didn't stop using paratroopers. They used them throughout the campaign with better results, but it was not a good result. There were storms that night, it just did not work out well. Achieved some objectives, not all the objectives that they wanted to. And on July the 10th, so this is what the situation looks like. So this is what we have. The Americans are landing here. The Canadian 1st Division is landing here. And they are on the left side of the British 8th. So they are making up like literally 1/5 of the British in 8th Army. Now remember, the 8th Army, tough, hardcore, experienced individuals. Canadians been playing in Scotland since 1940. That's what they're thinking. Okay? Canadians are the underdogs. Here comes the Americans, fresh out of their victory defeat in North Africa. Who's the weak link? It's the Canadians, because they have no experience. They have no battle experience whatsoever. So they land here, they land there. So if we go, I'm not going to go back because I just want to be conscious of time or I'll keep you here all night, this is the Allied plan for invasion. So the Canadians are landing here. So the first thing they want to be able to do is make sure they capture a port. They're not attacking a port because they want a port in order to offload. The British are going to go up into Catania and race for Messina. The Canadians are going to support here to be able to take the, because if you notice, these are really where these red circles are where the concentration of Axis troops are. The Americans are going to go this way, swing around the mountains, and come back this way in order to hit Messina. The goal is the British are going to take Messina. Canadians are going to support as part of that 8th. We're going to see later, with changes in battle, the Americans start to rush for Messina, because that's the glory. Okay, so again, in detail, this is where they are sitting. Here's Pacino. That is there's an airport in Machino. They want to be able to achieve that. And this is where the Canadian commandos lie, and the 51st Division British is on the other side of them. So when they land, this is certainly what they do. The Canadian assaults are the red line here. So this is what they do. The British come in. There's the Hastings Prince Edward. They go into Pacino. They capture Pacino on that first day. So they capture the airfields. Another lesson learned on that day is that they had thought that they had taken care of the Italian Air Force and the British, the German Air Force. It was not as effective as they needed. Another lesson learned for June the 6th. The Canadians captured the airport. The Canadians then, this is the Seaforth Highlanders, they're going up through what they call the marsh here, and the Royal Marine Commandos are here, and they're pushing up from there. So if you look at literally the first day, 24 hours, this is what's happening. The British have they've taken the port of Syracuse, they've achieved their objectives, and the Canadians have achieved their objectives as well. The Americans are here, they should have been linked. These 3 areas should have been linked at this point, but they are facing a little bit more resistance. The Canadians didn't face a lot of resistance on that date. And the reality is, why did they not face that resistance? Because the Sicilians were at the coastline. The Germans had a plan. We're not putting the German troops on the coast. We're keeping the German troops and the hardened Italian troops into the mountains. We're not going to defend the coast. We'll have the Sicilian volunteers. The Sicilian volunteers, they shot a couple of people, and then they ran away or gave up. Because again, remember, they were horribly treated. People were massacred. They stole supplies from the Sicilians, what little there was. There was not a lot of love in the Sicilians. The Sicilians didn't even like the Italians. So I mean, they're just like, it wasn't great. So they didn't fight hard. In fact, in the invasion, on the first 24 hours, only 7 Canadians were killed. 7. Now, 7 families mourned, but there was only 7 Canadians killed in the first 24 hours. It was not much. So they continued to be able to push. This is up until the 12th. Continue to be able to go into Monaca, Ragusa, and Gartana. They're achieving their objectives, as are the British. But then things start to tighten. Things start to tighten as they get their assault, because what's happening is when they start to get into these mountains, the German and the hardened Italian troops start to be able to fight. They're into the mountains. The coast areas are theirs. They're now starting to be able to get resistance. And on July the 13th, you can see this is what's occurred. And this is where things start to change. The first 3 days are fairly easy. Up until this point, approximately 15 Canadians have been killed. Is there a belief this is going to be a cakewalk? Not necessarily. They knew that the troops are out there. But these are now where the mountains start. But you notice that the Canadians have now linked with the Americans. And while the Canadian generals and the American generals never really got along, the reality is the lieutenants got along very well, and there was significant collaboration between the Americans and the Canadians. It was very successful. In fact, for the rest of the campaign, the Americans and the Canadians are on each other's flank, and they continue to be able to support each other. It's one of the lessons that are actually learned out of this. You can actually have collaboration, you just don't do it at this level. Get the mucky mucks out, let the people who know things how to do it, take care of it. The Italians surrendered in these first 3 days by the tens of thousands. In fact, overwhelmed the ability to be able to get them off the island. But these were the Sicilians. These were not the Italians yet. It's in the first 3 days. So July 19th, this is what we look like. So the Canadians and the Americans have continued to be able to, advance up, but the campaign stalls. If you remember, we had that big plain. Well, the Germans have resisted the 8th Army, the British 8th Army, and have stalled the British. So on the 19th, the Americans continue. They've linked all their elements. They're progressing slower than they had hoped, but they're achieving their objectives in the sense this is where they're going. But the British are stalled. So the tactic changes. The main drive was for the British to go up through Catania, up by Mount Etna, capture Messina. But it changes at that point because the British get stalled for days and weeks. So now the objective changes. And who takes over taking the front? It's the Canadians here on this. So they're saying, Canada, you're going to go up. I think I've just drawn it. Yep. I said, there's a Catania plain. This is where they get stalled. British get stalled there. They can't get across. The British have to, the Germans are defending it. And now it's up for the Canadians to be able to be able to go around the Catania plain, go up through the hills, come back behind the German forces at Catania in order to relieve the British. That's hard slogging. Do you see where the mountains are? It's in the Canadian way, and that's where the Canadians are, and the Canadians have to go across there. And this is where the heroism takes place for the Canadians. This is where Canadians learn very quickly on what it is to fight. Remember, these Canadians have no experience, no battle experience. But in one of the books that I read, what they said was the Canadians were different than the British. British believed their experience would teach them. The Americans believed that you didn't really have to learn. And what the Canadians did is they read and they studied and they were able to take that knowledge and turn it into battle experience. And it did work. So July 20th to 25th is the pivotal time frame in the Battle of Sicily where Canadians really make a difference and break the front. Karaoke downstairs if anybody wants to join. So this is where the two battles. The Battle of Leonforte and Asoro. Asoro is known from the Hasty P's. The Battle of Leonforte is for the Edmonton Regiment. The Seaforth was supposed to be able to take place, but unfortunately, friendly fire wiped out their headquarters, killed their leads, and so they were in disarray during the Battle of Leonforte. So the Edmonton Regiment had to kind of take the lead on this one. So Leonforte, the Edmonton had to come around the mountain. You can see where the mountain is, to be able to come back and attack Leonforte. They got into Leonforte with very little casualties. However, it was brutal house-to-house fighting in Leonforte, and there was extreme casualties on the Edmonton Regiment in fighting house-to-house. These were the hardened Italian troops and the Hermann Göring division that was defending Leonforte. Very, very hardened battle, who had all the equipment they wanted because they were Hermann Göring's regiment. So Leonforte took place. The battle is going on. They're trying to get to capture Leonforte. Again, sitting up on top of the mountain. And then what we have is the Hasty P's. And the Hasty P's have to be able to take Asoro. Asoro is sitting at the top of the mountain. It is heavily defended. It is going to be a brutal battle to be able to go up the mountains. There's one road into Asoro. It is a switchback that comes up in front of Asoro. And it literally goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So, you know what a switchback is. And they are the German artillery at the top of the mountain. They are going to be massacred in order to be able to get up that switchback. Because literally, it's like, they're okay, we don't get them then, well, get them when they come back. So they are trying to determine what they're going to do to be able to take Asoro. Now, at this point, the Edmonton Regiment is battling in Leonforte. So they expect to be able to gather together in order to be able to fight, but they're bogged down in Leonforte. It's taking longer to take it than they hoped. Brutal, brutal battle. So on that night, the Hasty P's decided they're going to do something different. So the Hasty P's have decided that, oh gosh, it's 9:15, I better hurry up. The Hasty P's decide what they're going to do is they're going to come up the back way. They're going to come up the back of the mountain. The Germans don't believe anybody can go up the back of the mountain. In fact, they only have one individual guarding the back way. Everybody else is kind of guarding the switchback. So 100 Hasty P's, 100 volunteer Hasty P's, just get rid of most of their equipment, get rid of most of their water, just take enough ammunition and guns in order to be able to come up that mountain pathway. And we're not talking, it's not a pathway. Like this is, it's not a gondola ride here at Wonderland. This is about going up, like the mountain. And just when they think, they have gotten to this place, they find out there's this huge chasm that they didn't see. So they go up at night. They're stripped of much equipment as they can and get to this. So what are they going to do? A lesser group of people would have given up and returned. They did not. They went into the chasm, literally scaled up this wall, hundreds of feet, and came up from behind and captured a Sorrow with minimal casualties in order to be able to get there. But Canadians have a lot of history about walking up the back of mountains in order to be able to go. We won't talk about the Quebec conquest. We'll leave that for some other day. But this is the pivotal moment in the Battle of Sicily. So they capture a Sorrow. Then the Germans, realizing they're in trouble, they start to evacuate. Then they also recognize that with the pressure coming from the Edmonton Regiment in Leon Forte, they realize they can't defend this. And so they evacuate, they retreat, which changes the complexity of that battle in order to be able to win that battle. So I'm going to skip over this because I'm running out of time. But Farley Mowat says in his book that every one of the Hasty P's who went up that mountain that night performed their own private miracle. There is a plaque that sits there now. Those 100 men changed the war. And they were volunteers, and this was going to be a suicide mission, but the Germans were not prepared. So once they certainly got a Sorrow, like I said, the Germans started to evacuate and started to go to Nicosia at the end of the 25th of July. Major General Guy Simmons had said that wanted to do a creeping barrage. So he'd shoot the artillery ahead of them, Canadians would follow. But the Germans, they weren't that stupid, so the Germans would just hide during the creeping barrage. When the barrage moved forward, the Canadians would come up, the Germans would pop up. So these days in the Battle of Sicily are the deadliest for Canadians. In fact, if you go to the cemetery, most of the deaths occur after this time period, because this is called, see what they want to do, the Canadians, see there's the Sorrow and Leon Forte. Their next job is to go to Agira and Adrano, because remember, they're coming back around to be able to help the British, who are still stuck in front of Catania. So this is what they're doing. They strive in order to get there. They capture Agira, which I'll talk to, and then are heading to Adrano in order to be able to help the British. So July 25th, Mussolini is thrown off he's out of Italy. He's deposed. July the 28th, they take Agira, and so therefore Agira is this is the video that I took. That is Agira.
Up there?
Yes, right on the top. Now, the Germans, recognizing the Canadians were there, evacuated Agira. It was 12 hours from being destroyed by the British Army, Air Force. But they got into Ajira, made the call, and Ajira was saved. I went to Ajira. It is a remarkable town, literally from the Roman era through Middle Ages to modern. It is walking back in time. I think I drank about 8 bottles of water going through there. So on July the 30th, again, the Seaforth Highlanders actually did a formal parade through Ajira. And again, I won't go through this because I'm running out of time. And next we're on at the end of the war, what they call the Highway of Death. Because this is the worst time for Canadians. So you can see the Canadians have come up through here, and from here, July 25th to August 5th or 6th, this is the frying pan. They call it the frying pan because flat bottom with the edges. The Germans are on the edges, the Canadians are coming up the middle. More Canadians are killed in these days of battle, and if you go to the Ajira Cemetery, most of the deaths are between that July the 30th and August 5th and 6th. It is a deadly battle, but necessary for the Canadians to be able to help out the British as you come along. And then August the 7th, the Canadians are put into reserve, and the battle ends for Canadians. Why are the Canadians put into reserve? Because this is what the front looks like. You see that the Americans have taken all the west, they've come this way. The British have now broken through because recognizing Asoro, Adrano is now taken. The Germans were like, uh-oh, we're in trouble, we're gonna retreat. The British have come up this way. The Canadians are here. Where do we go from here? So they said, oh, Canadians, your job's done. The British will take it from here. The Americans will drive this way. And the Canadians went into reserve. Now, they marched all these kilometers, suffered casualties, some of the toughest fighting, and they deserved and earned the rest. So again, won't touch base on that, will not touch base on that, but just the casualties, you can see the United Canada and Britain, there's 2,938 killed. So breaking the Canadian, there's 562 killed, 58 drowned, so over 10% on those 3 ships. 1,600 over 1,600 wounded, and 84 unfortunately spent the rest of the war as prisoners of war. I did visit the Ajira Canadian War Cemetery, and in the Ajira War Cemetery, 490 of the 562 Canadians, members, 58 were drowned. So the majority of the Canadians are buried, are interred in the Ajira War Cemetery. Ajira sits right in the middle, in the worst part, and that is the cemetery. From above, you can see how barren it is. And this is the video that I took when I visited Ajira War Cemetery. Again, in September, the weather is very similar to what our troops would have experienced. Dry as all get out. I was one of the few visitors, I'm probably the first visitor in about 2 months at Ajira at this point anyway. And so it is a desolate place, it's in the middle of nowhere, but certainly, as you see, it sits on top of the mountain. And just very quickly, these are some of the individuals that I picked out that are buried in the Ajira Cemetery. I'll just go through these because I do realize I've talked way too long. And again, there's a Barrett, there's no relation, but just found him and I've adopted him since. So the people from Nova Scotia, because the Nova Scotia Regiment is here, they made stones. I said to Probus, if I ever go back again, I like this idea, I will do the same thing. I can do that. I don't think the customs would take them away from me. But just, again, my last video, this is out the back of the cemetery. And I just want to show this to you, to show you the landscape that our soldiers were fighting in. This is deadly landscape. Foreshadows what happens in Italy later on. I mean, you're seen for miles on anything. And this is not the highest spot. Ajira is the highest spot. This is just the cemetery. Okay, I did visit the Commonwealth War Cemetery as well. I won't go through this either. This is where Again, 12 Canadians are buried. So I almost saw all of the Canadians between the two cemeteries in Catania. Now, very, very quickly, just the lessons learned is like, what was the impact? It controlled the Mediterranean. It got Italy out of the war. It did lead to the invasion of Italy. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. Roosevelt did not want to invade Italy. Churchill pushed for it. It was the first return to continental Europe. I mean, people always think of June the 6th. Reality is, Sicily's part of continental Europe. And there's a lot of lessons learned in 1944. And they were destroy your coastal batteries. They didn't destroy the coastal batteries in Sicily, played havoc with the Allies. Paratrooper, get more effective with your paratroopers. One general full-time. Eisenhower worked on this invasion plan part-time. So right after Sicily, they said, Eisenhower, you're going to be the supreme commander. One general, one goal, one mission, June the 6th. And that's what he worked on. So they learned this wasn't, part-time's not going to work. Land and sea efforts had to be coordinated. Sand on the beaches played havoc for the American tanks. June 6, 1944, before they went in D-Day, they had individuals go at night, get the sand from the beaches of Normandy and test it to see whether or not the tanks would go on it. All as a result, because the tanks got stuck on the beaches in Sicily. So a lot of lives were saved. Surprise works, that whole mincemeat. I mean, the Germans were absolutely certain we were going to Cherbourg, not into Normandy. So that whole ruse, they took that from mincemeat, not the dead body, but that let's pretend we're going someplace else. They need more shipping resources. They doubled the shipping resources. They did realize, you know what, we can supply an army by unloading them. So this was a lesson. They didn't think they could. They proved they could in Sicily. It started lessons for the Italian campaign because of the mountains, air superiority. They did not wipe out the Italian Air Force and the Luftwaffe. They realized they have to do a better job, and they have to do better on air and sea bombardment as well when they go in. Lessons learned for Canadians, and I'm almost done. There was a lot of reputational oops for Canadians. Remember, they were seen as the weak link, but they proved themselves. They were the surprise. They were the surprise because they fought much better than they thought they would be able to fight. I talked about the American-Canadian cooperation. It impacted the Canadians at Juno because the Canadians were supposed to go back to Britain, join the 1st Canadian Army, and then invade. But no, they decided they were going to go into Italy. The Canadians went into Italy. A lot of the Italian campaign was fought by Canadians. They never put the Canadians back together again. That was a result of this. And as I said, the Canadians walked. They didn't have their equipment, and they were known as the Red Patch Devils. They had the Red Patch insignia. The Germans called them the Red Patch Devils. They were afraid when the Canadians were on the other side. Canadians didn't give up. They called them mountain fighters. These weren't mountain fighters. These people came from Saskatchewan. They weren't mountain fighters, but they were so good at it. They called them mountain fighters. The Canadians gained a lot of reputational value out of this. And I know I talked a lot. I apologize. I get passionate. And thank you. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the short version of your presentation.
You told me to keep it to half an hour.
I told him to give it half an hour, and of course he always listens to me. But I want to thank you very much for that interesting presentation. I've read a lot over the years about the Canadian effort, and really I was enlightened as to what went on. And I learned a lot, and that's what we're here for, is to share history and our love of history, and especially our understanding of Canadian military effort during this time leading up to November 11th. So thank you very much, Michael, and we'll have you again sometime. Next month, November the 28th is our next meeting. It's our Christmas surprise.
Oh,
Yes. So,
Santa Claus gonna be here?
Santa Claus may be here. He doesn't know it yet. But we haven't quite finalized the full extent of what we're doing. That's why it's a surprise. So I'll be surprised when I get here too. But please Thank you for coming. There's still some refreshments at the back. I know we went a little longer than we normally do, but if you want to stay and talk and look at the veteran information, especially in those binders along the walls, we have a lot of what's on our website. So it's alphabetical. If you have a loved one that is served near Lakeville, they may very well be in there. And if they're not, get their military history and we can put them in there. So thanks once again for coming, and good night.